Good day and welcome everybody. My name is David Walker. I'm Executive Director of the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's. And I'd like to thank you all for being here for this special occasion. As we begin, I would, as always, like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. This has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. As we begin, some housekeeping before I introduce my friend Helen. We will be using Slido to ask questions. So if you're not familiar and you have a device, go to slido.com. The code is MPA19, and that will allow you to ask questions and also, as important, to vote on questions that you see that you might like so that we can crowdsource the most relevant questions to pepper Helen with in a minute. If you're on live stream, you can do it as well. And we will also have the opportunity for people who want to stand up and ask a question as well. So our guest, Helen Cooper, is a distinguished fellow of the Queen's School of Policy Studies. She graduated from Queen's with a B.Sc in chemistry and mathematics and then worked for a year as a chemist at Procter Gamble in Hamilton. Then, following a very linear career path, she went to CUSO for 2 years with a stint teaching in Tanzania. Following that, a master's at the London School of Economics in Econometrics followed. Upon her return to Kingston, building on that career path, she was elected a municipal councillor in 1980. She served as Kingston's first woman mayor from 1988 to 1993, following which she was for 3 years chair of the Ontario Municipal Board. In the early 90s, Helen served as president of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. She was a member of the Premier's Council on Health Strategy and the Ontario Roundtable on Environment and Economy. From there, again, following a very consistent career path, she was a member of the Advisory Council on the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. From 2006 until 2014, Helen was a manager with the Ministry of Community and Social Services. And during all those years, although I knew Helen from the very beginning, I think we met more frequently on the train to Toronto than any other place. Since then, she's been an enthusiastic supporter and contributor to Queen's School of Policy Studies and has been heavily engaged with Oasis Senior Supportive Living, where she recently became president. This latter is a very interesting, perhaps sentinel initiative in health policy for an aging population, and my MPA 836 students might be interested in that part of the municipal landscape. Helen's topic is Notwithstanding Cities, and I look forward to hearing from you, Helen.
Now, which is the microphone it's the right-hand one? I worry if I use the tray, will I be too far away from the microphone? I know that's the most frustrating thing of all with any presenter. Sorry,
It's that one.
it's just this one?
Yeah.
She's got me all confused and we haven't even started. Okay. This, as you can gather from the title, this presentation was precipitated by events in September when Premier Ford, the newly elected Premier of Ontario, took a rather bold step towards deciding unilaterally that the size of the Toronto Municipal Council was far too large, and he, with a stroke of a pen, cut it virtually in half. And this caused many people to wonder, how was he able to do that? Including Premier Ford. This was not part of their campaign in June when he was first elected. I suspect, though I don't know for sure, that Premier Ford wasn't aware himself of the power that he then held, particularly with respect to Toronto City Council, for which I think for the most part he had little love. Now, I explained to David before I started, as you could see from my, as David called it, linear career path, I have been outside of municipal politics for quite some time. So it was a good exercise for this presentation that I had to do some homework. First of all, there are 4 documents that are essential to understanding what Premier Ford was able to do. The first is the Constitution Acts, and I will put a caveat in at this point. I am not a constitutional expert. I am not a legal expert. But what I'm saying here, I'm fairly confident to be able to tell you. And it's a basic understanding I think we should all have about how we are governed in this country. So there are 4 essential documents to understanding what's happened recently: the Constitution Acts, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Municipal Act, and the City of Toronto Act. I'm just concentrating on Ontario. All provinces have municipal acts or equivalent, but they do vary. And I'll just concentrate on Ontario's, and we can extrapolate from that if you wish. Now, I'm going to rely heavily throughout this presentation on quotes from various people in the Globe and Mail. As a former municipal politician, I was absolutely thrilled that suddenly the interests of cities were being taken seriously. They haven't been very much for many, many years. And there was a sense of outrage on the part of people like Mr. Saunders, for whom I have great respect. I think he's an excellent columnist. But it was a real wake-up call, I think, for many people. And as Doug Saunders wrote in the Globe and Mail, Canada's constitution provides no right to democratic government at the municipal level because cities and municipal governments simply don't exist as constitutional entities or independent jurisdictions in Canada. And stated more bluntly, Canadians may think they have the right to elect their local government, but they don't. It is not, local government is not a right at all. It has no constitutional status. If those of you who are interested in delving into this further, it's section 92(8) of the Constitution Acts, which gives the legislature of each province exclusive responsibility for making laws relating to that province's municipal institutions. The scope of provincial control over municipalities is largely unfettered. Provinces can alter municipalities' boundaries or powers, as well as their financial resources, and can abolish individual municipalities. And of course, that's what happened to Toronto in the era of Mike Harris as premier. Individual municipalities within Metro Toronto were destroyed. I guess that's too harsh a term, but they were folded into one large Toronto municipality. Those of you who live in the Ottawa area, Ottawa-Carleton became Ottawa. Those of you who live in Hamilton area, Hamilton-Wentworth became Hamilton. There were a lot of rural municipalities that were folded into each other. The city of Kingston doubled in size when it became incorporated with 2 townships to the east and the west. So through the Harris years, there was a great deal of change in municipal boundaries and a great deal of opposition, both from municipal politicians and from constituents, but it did proceed. Now, the next is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is incorporated into the Constitution Act, and that the essential component of the Charter, which is of interest to us, is the so-called Notwithstanding Clause. Those of us who were in any way involved in the constitutional debates of the Trudeau and the Mulroney era, the Charlottetown Accord, I could remember it well, being somebody who was brought into action by Premier Ray to go out and proselytize about the wonders of the Charlottetown Accord for all the good it did. But in any case, there is in the Constitution this Notwithstanding Clause, which several premiers, I believe Premier Lougheed of Alberta was the one who proposed it as a compromise, to try to get every province to sign on. And what they were saying is you have to agree to all these rights, but there's a get-out clause. And Doug Ford discovered about the get out clause. The new Premier of Quebec is in the process of discovering how to be able to use this notwithstanding clause. The point being here, and that's what constitutional scholars have been writing op-eds in the Globe and various other places, is that if it's used too often under too many circumstances, then the whole charter is up for grabs. And does it really mean very much if it can be overthrown so easily? Now, in Ontario, there's something called the Municipal Act. It has to be one of the largest pieces of legislation in the province by page. I don't know how many pages it is, but it's a lot. And it's the legislation by which municipalities exist. It's the legislation that forms incorporations, which are municipalities. And the first Municipal Act in Ontario was passed in 1849. I've tried to give you some context for it. Just before that, York, which it wasn't even Toronto at that point, had a population of just under 10,000. Kingston, which was a fairly significant city in those days, it had a population of just over 6,000. So times have changed, and we'll look at that just a little bit more in a minute. But as I pointed out in this slide, municipalities continue to be creatures of statute. Isn't that a lovely phrase? As corporations, and they are created by provincial statute through the Municipal Act. They can only exercise those powers that they are given by the statute. And their decisions are subject to review by the courts to prevent them from exceeding statutory authority. And lastly, the City of Toronto Act. There's been some recognition by the province in recent years that Toronto is special because it is so huge. And Toronto is special because it cannot afford to fail. It's like the big banks, right? We've reached a point of size in municipal government in Toronto that were Toronto to suddenly disappear, there would be unmitigated chaos. So in 2006, the City of Toronto Act was passed to allow Toronto, uniquely Toronto in Ontario, to have certain powers of taxation that the rest of the province, municipalities and the rest of the province simply don't have. There was a land transfer tax and there was a vehicle registration tax. The vehicle registration tax has not been used because Premier Rob Ford ran on something called the War on the Car, and as a result he vowed he would never collect taxes on people buying cars. It did a couple of other things as well, as I've listed there. But Toronto still can't do most of the things it wants to do without provincial permission. And one of the best examples came from the one that I've written up there, when the city wanted to put tolls. The point being, of course, that Toronto is surrounded by a very large population outside of the city of Toronto itself. And they were trying to get suburbanites to pay at least something for the maintenance of roads. What happened is they proposed tolls on the Gardner and the Don Valley Parkway, and Kathleen Wynne, I expect with a number of fairly powerful people in her cabinet who were from suburban GTA, who said, no way, we're going into an election campaign soon. Prospects are not good. We are not going to allow this to happen. So as John Tory felt the rug had been pulled out from under him, having had a positive signal initially, and then told, no, you can't do it. So I apologize, the writing on the map is not very clear, but I'm trying to show you population distribution. This is the 2016 census, so the most recent data we have. Population of Canada is just over 35 million, population of Ontario is 13.5 million. So then I started going, okay, the city of Toronto, which is the smallest, I don't have a pointer, but the green, well, I'll go around the green. Durham region, York region, Toronto, Peel region, Halton region, Hamilton, and Niagara region. Okay? And so the smallest in land area of that group is Toronto. The city of Toronto is 2.7 million. The Greater Toronto Area, which is everything but Hamilton and Niagara, has, what have I written up there, 6.4 million. The Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is being referred to most frequently these days, because I don't know if you're taking the 401 over to the, what is it? I'm losing my numbers here, but anyway, the road system all the way around the bottom of Lake Ontario, it's wall-to-wall people now. So it's really, the economic area is really that whole green area, and that's now over 9 million people. So what does that leave for the rest of Ontario? Just over 4 million people. So what we have is a jurisdiction controlling at whim 9.2 million people. And then I thought, oh, well, we'll just put a contrast in here. Prince Edward Island population is the same roughly as the population of the city of Kingston. And Prince Edward Island has constitutional powers, Toronto doesn't. So, one of my students I was talking to earlier in this term talked about budgets. So I thought, okay, let's have a look at budgets. So here we go. I'll let you look at that. Money is important here. And you can see Toronto comes just after Saskatchewan. So we have Ontario, Quebec, B.C., Alberta, Saskatchewan, Toronto. Sorry, what's going on here? I'm shouting into it?
No, it's pop.
It's pop, okay. And so we finally get to Toronto. And then after that, all the maritime provinces and Newfoundland have budgets that are smaller than the city of Toronto. Now that doesn't fit with the population slide I showed you just a minute ago. But of course, the reason there is that half of provincial budgets now are on healthcare, something roughly just under half. So that's a huge expense that's borne by the province that's not borne by the municipality. Education is the other really big budget item. So the provincial budgets are weighted upward, but at the same time, even with Toronto not having jurisdiction in those areas, you can see that it's heavily weighted against the smaller provinces in Canada. What do municipalities do? I apologize if the print is too small to read. I started to make the list, and then I went away, and I'd come back, and I'd add something else to the list, and then I'd add something else to the list. So my list got longer and longer and longer, and I may well have forgotten something. That could quite easily be the case. But that's what municipalities do. I have a little anecdote here. A very prominent professor of the School of Policy Studies, long retired, I will never name names. It was a constituent of mine when I was a city councillor, and we, amongst recreation services, we built skating rinks in City Park, one for hockey and one for leisure skating. And it's been a big debate on council for years because our freezing and thawing cycles in the winter are so pronounced now that you just get the rink made and it thaws and then you have to go through the whole exercise again. So our Parks Department was saying, is this really worth doing? And our budget debates are all open, and so they're reported in the local media, and this professor who had 2 young kids stopped me in the street and said he was protesting greatly about the potential loss of these skating rinks. And he then said to me, "That's the only municipal service we use." Well, I lost it. I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." I said, "I mean, you don't flush your toilet. You don't expect the fire department to come if your house is on fire. You don't expect your garbage to be picked up when you put it out every week, etc." And we were not good friends to begin with, but he was a bit cold for a while. But anyway, that's a long time ago now. Most municipal services we take completely for granted. And when they aren't working, it is a big deal. I don't know if anybody here was in Toronto during the garbage strike in David Miller's mayoral time, but you were. You know what that meant. When people ask me as mayor what were the biggest issues I dealt with, by far, if there were anything that was going to keep me awake at night, I tell them it was sewage and garbage. And we had a crisis with the closure of a landfill site, and we're at one point trucking garbage to Ottawa, which is profoundly non-environmentally sensitive, but had no choice. Again, not a good relationship with the province over that problem. We, for years and years, this city, because it's such an old city with such an old sewer system, had in many places still what we called combined sewers, so that what would happen is, especially if there was a storm, raw sewage would be entering Lake Ontario. And for years and years, by the end of the summer, the health unit would come around and put signs up down on the waterfront saying, "Don't swim here." And I, as mayor, solved that problem. It was the hottest issue in the 91 election because we put a surcharge on water. And that was to pay for a whole storm water containment system. So what is down by the lake now are these huge concrete tanks underground that when there's a big storm, and we had more than one this summer, the sewage flow to the treatment plant can't take it all at once. These are retention tanks that release the water more slowly, and then it can all be treated before it goes into, in our case, into St. Lawrence River. And so anyway, I feel really proud that we were able to do that, and we were able to sell it to the community. It's hard selling raising a tax. It's really, really hard. And but I always tease about it. I'm saying we had to do this on our own initiative. We would never get provincial or federal funding for this because you can't put a plaque on an underground sewage retention tank. Okay, I've got to speed things up. This is taking too long. I mean, municipalities derive most of their income from property tax. I put it in bigger notes because it matters way, way more than any of the other things that I've listed there. Property tax is a very complicated and challenging issue. And I've put up a number of things here to explain it. Municipalities, property assessment it's based on what's called highest and best use of property. It's determined provincially. Municipalities cannot individually manipulate an assessment on a property. And there are factors as well, which complicate matters even further. I've shown it there. Now, the factor for industrial commercial is much higher than for single-family dwellings. But so you would say, well, if a municipality wants to attract business, why don't they lower the factor on industrial commercial? Well, the answer is that the only people who vote in municipal elections are people who own single-family dwellings. I can make a few exceptions there. Renters, students don't see any connection between themselves and the municipality, which is understandable very often. I mean, those of you who are MPA students are probably only in Kingston for a year. And so the tax system is all warped in favor of single-family property owners. The other thing I put down there is large rental. If you get two buildings that are exactly the same, one a condo and one a rental, the rental is paying significantly more property tax than the condo. And we would say that that's really, because generally renters are not as well off as condo owners. That's a generalization. But it seems somewhat skewed. Ergo, very often property tax is a regressive tax. It's taxing the people most who are the least wealthy. And does the federal government involve itself in municipalities? Very, very carefully. The provinces get very upset if I do. Again, I'm going back to the Mike Harris government. There used to be a whole system of what were called unconditional grants, and they wiped those out. And in essence, unconditional grants were, here's some money for the municipality with no strings attached. It was, in essence, giving municipalities a share of income tax indirectly. But that's gone now. That's completely gone. And there are also so what does it mean in terms of what municipalities are able to do using taxing instruments? Well, they can influence consumption. They can charge development charges, but it's only the fast-growing municipalities that can. Mississauga is the classic example. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the temple that is the Mississauga City Hall, but that is development charge money. And developers didn't complain. It was really stretching the principle of development charges, but they were so eager to get into Mississauga that they were prepared to pay that price. The Kingston, as an already fairly highly developed municipality, doesn't do nearly as well out of development charges. The other very important point to make here, though, is they're only good the first time round when you're developing. So what a municipality ends up with, and I think Mississauga and some of the more aging suburbs are discovering, is that, okay, they 60-foot lots and wide boulevards and all this great stuff that somebody else paid for now has to be replaced. And that has to come out of municipal coffers. The other important point that I made on this slide is municipalities cannot incur deficits. They can borrow money for capital projects, but their operating budget has to balance at the end of the year. And that's a huge difference between them and the province and the feds. Now, I've already talked about this. Mike Harris did quite a job of realigning costs. It was supposed to be revenue neutral, but it was in no way revenue neutral. The best example of that is Toronto Housing. It was, an estimate of the value of that housing, but it didn't take into account the costs of refurbishment, repair, etc. So that Toronto municipality has a huge problem now in repairing social housing. Now, I also put in the Mike Harris Who Does What changes influenced, punished, I don't know if that's the right word, inner city governments. because of course, the population that every politician in Ontario is after at the provincial or federal level is the so-called 905. If you get it, you get in. If you lose it, you lose. And so those changes were certainly beneficial to suburbs. What Doug Ford is doing now, too, with reducing the size of city council, is putting greater weight on the opinions of the suburban councillors within Toronto, because the population, any of you have traveled to Toronto at all recently and seen the number of high-rise condos in downtown Toronto, know that the population shift is towards the city centre. So, 10 minutes left. I'm getting to the whole point of this exercise. What did Doug Ford do? Well, he introduced, the titles they give these bills are just so lovely. This was the Better Local Government Act, reduced city council. I had from 44 to 25. That's a bit confusing. It's actually 47 to 25 because the City of Toronto had done an exhaustive consultation on this, what should be the size of City Council, and had decided it should be 47. And for the very reason that I told you a few minutes ago, that population was shifting to the city centres, so the wards in downtown Toronto had to be carved up and increased. Well, we've gone exactly the opposite direction. What happened on September 10th? The Ontario Superior Court, because City of Toronto took the province to court. Remember all this in the context of me telling you that municipalities have to do whatever the province tells them they have to do. So what were the grounds for Toronto doing this? Well, they were arguing it was an infringement of people's rights because this was in the middle of an election campaign and it was throwing Toronto municipal election into complete disarray. Well, but if it hadn't been the middle of an election campaign, there wouldn't have been a court case at all, right? And that was argued by many people. Why couldn't he just wait 4 years from now? But he was clearly in a big hurry. And then September 12th, the government introduces the use of the notwithstanding clause, which is when all the eyebrows went up big time. And then the province went to the courts and demanded a stay, which they were given. So that means, in other words, the province was going to appeal the first court decision. The Court of Appeal was saying, we'll grant a stay on the original decision. That appeal will still have to go forward. But it's moot at this point because after this, there won't be an election and the province can just do what it likes. So here's the reaction. Now, Benjamin Perrin worked for Stephen Harper, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I can let you read these for yourself, but I guess we'll go through them together. You start out using the notwithstanding clause in something not a ton of people care a lot about. Well, that crushed me when I read that. Here they were completely, the province was completely altering the state of municipal politics in the biggest city in the country. And Mr. Perrin was suggesting not many people cared. And perhaps he's right. The size of municipal government. Do any of us really care what the size of our municipal government is? He's saying this is the tip of the iceberg. And of course, that's what's really worrying now for many people is that Premier Ford has discovered he has a notwithstanding clause. Municipalities in particular are going, when is he going to use it again and how is he going to use it? And then Andrea Horvath suggested it was a personal vendetta against his enemies at Toronto City Hall. And I won't go into Premier Ford's record as a Toronto councillor, but it was in the very stormy days, of course, of the Rob Ford mayoralty. And then, but Marcus Gee was saying, don't get your knickers in a knot here. This isn't the end of the world. Well, moving to 25 councillors, because the boundaries are now consistent with the federal and provincial ridings, right? So anybody living in Toronto has an MP, an MPP, and a city councillor. An average population of a Toronto riding is just over 100,000. That means if we were to carry this to maybe a logical conclusion, the city of Kingston would have one mayor and one councillor. And I put this to you when I showed you that list of what municipalities do. Does that make sense? Now, of course, municipal governments are not parliaments. Everybody who runs is their own political party. They may have affiliations to another political party, but in Ontario, not the case in some other cities, it's every man and woman councillor for themselves, right? So it can be perceived as dysfunctional because there's no whip. Alliances form and disintegrate and reform depending on the issue. But I'm sympathetic to John Tory, who in essence, as mayor for the last 4 years, said, well, actually, Toronto City Council has been fairly functional. What people really remember is the Toronto City Council of the Rob Ford era, which was clearly totally dysfunctional. I obviously am a bias towards Doug Saunders. I think he's very good. But I think he was really cutting to the heart of the matter. One that cuts across grows more acute in this country we're a very, very urban nation. That our cities as political and constitutional and democratic entities do not exist. I think this is a serious problem for this country. I can just let you read the rest of the quotes as we move along really rapidly here. And the last one is Alice Wooley, who is out in Calgary. And I really liked what she had to say. In essence, we see constitutional and legal scholars saying our system of government is dysfunctional because what was the Municipal Act started in 1849 is not what we live in today. And yet our terms of governance have completely changed. Sorry, our terms of government have not changed. So, what does a city like Toronto have to face? And I hope I've established at least a case that it does not have the tools to do it. It needs an integrated public transportation network. We know public transit in Toronto is a huge issue that is not being resolved very quickly at all. And now, in fact, Premier Ford has made noises about taking over the subway system, but not the bus system or the tram system. So we could become increasingly dysfunctional in trying to get around in Toronto. We know certainly David Walker can speak to the opioid crisis and the need for supervised drug use sites, which municipalities can't establish without provincial authority approval. We know immigration is a huge issue in this country, particularly recently with asylum seekers, and we know those people are going to the cities where they already have support systems and cultural oases. We know social housing. Housing is a huge issue in this country. How much people are, what percentage of many people are paying of their income on their cost of housing. And I was looking, I'll just very quickly, got one more minute, talk about the fact that CMHC is a completely different animal from what it used to be. CMHC, as a federal entity, was heavily involved in on-the-ground development of housing. When I was first elected to City Council, there was a $1 million fund in the city that was at the city from CMHC, and Kingston wasn't that big a city, so there were lots of others like it. CMHC had given over this money and said, use it however you want to develop affordable housing in your community. And what did we do? We used no interest repayable loans to develop apartments above shops in downtown Kingston, which I would say was a wildly successful program. Not only in terms of providing downtown housing, but also in terms of revitalizing downtown. We rescued Friendship Homes, which was a home for former psychiatric patients who were no longer living in institutions but needed supportive housing. We established home-based housing, which is a referral agency for social housing. We also got heavily involved in developing not-for-profit housing, for which we got low-interest mortgage money from CMHC. So the list goes on and on. That's all gone. So in other words, federal government has completely detached itself from provision of housing. The other is Indigenous affairs that I've listed here, which we talk about Indigenous people on reserve, but there are more living in cities. And the service supports or understanding is inadequate. So, very quickly going through the last two slides, how do we fix this? Some people have suggested cities just get a share of sales tax. There are charter cities in Canada, Vancouver. St. John, New Brunswick is the oldest charter city. Vancouver, Montreal, Winnipeg have charters, but again, their powers bequeathed to them by the provincial government. They could be removed. They're not likely to be, but they could be. I said secession of Toronto. I believe Jennifer Kismet, who's running for Mayor of Toronto, is advocating that Toronto or the GTA secede from the province of Ontario. But could we go one step further? And this is where Lynn Freeman will be thrilled to hear from me. It's been a hobby horse of mine for years. We form city-states that are all across the province once we get a certain population center, and we take them all out of provincial jurisdiction, and we give them constitutional authority. And then the provinces can deal with rural and small-town areas. And end of slideshow. Oh, that was my end. I'm sorry. That was an abrupt end. I thought there was one more slide. Anyway, I've talked way too long.
Thank you, Helen. So, while Celia guns up Slido, should we have one question from the audience? Any hands up? Nobody dares. Well, oh, here's one. Yes, Pat.
Sorry, I can never.
Well, yeah, I'd
like to commend you as a fellow woman elector when we used to watch City Council like hawks, and she took up the challenge and she went for it, you know. And I think it's good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, I had no ambition to enter municipal politics, and I stayed with it, right, for 16 years in one way or another, and it's absorbing. It's completely absorbing.
Question number 1. Montreal has 65 city councillors, Vancouver has 10. Is there a right size of council?
I have no idea. And I think it's an interesting thought to pursue. Yeah, it's all over the map. I think I tried to show that the Toronto case is somewhat extreme. What will happen, of course, with one councillor in a size of a riding is that they will become fairly separated from their constituency. They'll need much bigger office staffs. I don't know. Kingston had a huge council. When we were 60,000, we had a council of, including the mayor, of 15. That's big, but Kingston's an old city, so that historically it had all these people. You could look at a Mississauga, has a very small council because it just started off as a small township, and as it grew, it deliberately chose to keep its council small. But it's a worthy academic study. What is the right size for a municipal council? Well, it will vary because it depends on whether it's a urban or a rural municipality. I just talked primarily about Toronto. There are still over 400 municipalities in Ontario, and most of them are really small rural township places with councils of 5 people. So there's no rhyme or reason to any of this.
All right. Question number 2, you've sort of answered, so maybe I could modify it slightly and ask you, if you are to achieve Toronto and other large municipalities becoming similar to a province or adopting provincial powers, how would you do it? And what might be some of the unintended consequences of doing it?
Well, we as a country are in a frozen state when it comes to our Constitution, right? It's we dance around it. Never shall we reopen the Constitution. Anybody who went through the wounds of the 80s and the 90s, I think it's inevitable. I think I showed you in terms of the fiscal capacity of Toronto. Toronto desperately needs an income tax to function. And now, of course, the rabbit hole we can all jump down then is to say, oh, but does that mean Toronto will just go into debt like the province has and like the feds have, and in this never-ending spiral? I think the risk is worth it. I think we're naive to think Toronto isn't in debt. I think that slide I showed you where the infrastructure deficit of Toronto is, what, 30 billion, something close to that? That's a form of debt.
All right, next, I'm interested in your thoughts on changes to election, non-election of regional chairs. That was also a part of the Ford government's municipal policies.
Yeah, I didn't go there because I didn't have time. As very clear, I didn't have time for what I did. There were 2 regions, I believe, and I can't remember which 2, where, Peel for sure, and what was the other one? York and Peel, where the regional chair, again, I was not getting into this too far because to do the treatise on municipal government takes more than 40 minutes, but there are lower and upper tier municipalities in those regions. Just like here, there are counties in the smaller areas of the population areas of the province. The different regions had chosen their regional chair, head of regional government, differently. And these 2 regions were, they were chosen from within the council, if I'm not mistaken. And the Liberals changed that to have election at large. Premier Ford scotched that. So it's status quo for those two regions, which is different from the other regions. Patrick Brown was running for regional chair in, which one was it, York or Peel? It was York. I have no proof, but it may have had something to do with the fact that Mr. Brown was Mr. Ford's predecessor, and he may, going back to Andrea Horthath's statement, there may have been something personal about that.
All right. How could constitutional status be extended to municipalities while recognizing differences between provinces?
Well, I guess what I'm in essence saying is what we have now in Ontario is, except for separated cities, Kingston is the separated city, that's why I say it gets so messy, but what we have in essence is 4 tiers. We have the local government, the regional or county government, the provincial government, and the federal government. And this is all for just over 30 million people, right? We can't say we aren't governed. And my suggestion here is, no, you define population areas that are urban, and you give them, in essence, provincial status. And then, so they're carved out of the provinces. And then, now, I mean, we could go on a great flight of fancy here and still go even further and say, well, should PEI be amalgamated into Nova Scotia or whatever? I haven't gone so far with that. I've just said, take the major urban areas, which are not that hard to define, namely Vancouver, probably Calgary. I have to, obviously I'm doing this off the top of my head, certainly Toronto, certainly Montreal, Halifax, Winnipeg, and give them provincial constitutional status. What that in essence does is eliminate one level of government. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but I think the demands of urban regions are such that something fundamental has to change. And I mean, getting a premier in Ontario like Premier Ford is a really interesting challenge for municipalities in terms of will this precipitate some fairly extreme action sooner rather than later?
Thank you. The next one is, rather than decrease the size of council, what changes could have been implemented to actually improve the efficiency or effectiveness of Toronto City Council?
I have some real sympathy for John Tory here, and I'm repeating myself. I think he stated recently that things at Toronto City Council have actually been functioning quite well. What we have stuck in our memories is the Rob Ford phenomenon. And of course that could happen again, right? Well, look, it's, you know, populist people are elected in a number of governments, and look what chaos they are causing. So it could happen. It could easily happen. But I don't think Toronto City Council is particularly inefficient or ineffective. I challenge that. First of all, another thing I did not go into here is we have what's called a weak mayor system in Ontario. A mayor just has one vote on council, and a mayor does not have any power of veto. And in Toronto, the mayor has certain powers that mayors other places don't have, i.e. in choosing an executive council, which is a way of wielding power and gaining supporters for various moves on council. But most people think mayors can do a lot more than they can through what power is given to them. So a good mayor is automatically a consensus builder. It's the only way that a municipal council can function. I don't know what the inner workings of Toronto City Council are these days, but my sense is that John Tory's actually pretty good at that. And so there aren't too many headlines coming out of City Council these days.
Next question. With no constitutional status, can municipalities avoid some provincial or federal policies so the municipal level can better reflect the voice of the people?
No. I mean, that was very clearly evident in what happened in September. There was certainly a voice of the people, a fairly significant one, I think, saying, don't do this, don't reduce the size of council. And why was that happening? Because the Toronto City Council had gone through this extensive consultation and had come up with the most acceptable response, which was to increase the size of council. I can't emphasize strongly enough how hamstrung municipal governments are in terms of what they can or can't do. The other thing I also didn't point out, which I very quickly can, both the province and the feds are property owners in municipalities. That's certainly clear in Kingston, the very ground we are standing and sitting on now. Provinces and feds and the broader public sector, i.e. schools, hospitals, universities, do not pay property tax. They pay a grant in lieu of tax. And in a case such as the Queen's, which is on the best real estate in the city, that grant in no way is covering what it is the value of this property. The counter argument is Queen's is this huge economic engine stabilizing force on municipal finances in the city, so you can't have everything.
Thank you. Do you agree with, is that the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, or AMO's push to increase HST by 1% to support municipalities? Do you think it will ever happen? That's
been a lobbying effort for years and years and years, and it is true in some American cities. Again, American cities operate very differently because they have a strong mayor system, which is quite different from what we experience in our country. And in some instances, they do get a share of sales tax. The argument for that is, of course, that it's a counter-inflationary move. Property tax is not, and it might happen. It might happen. I don't know. I mean, raising taxes these days is not a popular concept anywhere, and I don't know.
Maybe the last one. Let's pop to, does the creation of charter cities potentially create have-not areas that are governed by tax bases, e.g. rich cities get richer, poorer get poorer? And I'd add to that, if you create a charter city or Toronto becomes province-like, would it then create its own healthcare system to the detriment?
Well, yeah, I guess, I mean, David, that's a really good question, and the implications are boundless in terms of the kind of restructuring that would have to occur. It does boggle the mind. But charters potentially create have-not areas. Well, I think I pointed out to you already that Toronto, in essence, is a charter city through the City of Toronto Act. The City of Kingston cannot charge a vehicle registration tax or a land transfer tax. Of course, Toronto's about to land with a huge thud with this, in that the land transfer tax has, I believe, increased since it was implemented, some 300 or 400%, because the real estate boom has been so huge. But that's not going to go on forever, right? And then they're going to be in trouble. And Peter Wallace, who I know has warned about this. He's their, one of the most important financial experts in the province. I think in the overall scheme of things, because of what services the City of Toronto is expected to provide, small rural municipalities, for the most part, are much better off. They provide very few services, nor is there an expectation for them to do so. So I don't know that we are saying charter cities are necessarily, citizens of charter cities are necessarily better off. I think somebody had her hand up.
One question, and then we will draw to a close.
Thank you for taking your time to come and speak with us today. My name is Julie. I work for the City of Toronto. I'm curious, as a female leader, what was your largest challenge to overcome while sitting as mayor in Toronto, and how did you approach the task?
In the days of Me Too, it's kind of fascinating. And I appreciate you work for the City of Toronto. I feel vindicated because with many things I was saying, she was nodding her head. This was very reinforcing. I ran for mayor in '88, and the editorial, there were 3 of us from council, long-serving councillors, 2 women and a man. The Whig Standard read an editorial said, "Can people distinguish between 2 women?" The male who ran against me ran a campaign based on, is Kingston ready for a woman mayor? So that I had a very significant hurdle to overcome. Just one little anecdote. About 6 months into my term, I ran into a police sergeant at City Hall whom I'd known in high school. I always tease about that because I thought, well, here was somebody, perfect police officer, would understand the criminal mind. But he said, "Oh, Helen, things aren't going nearly as badly as some people thought they were going to." So I was an object of immense curiosity. Even though, you know, Charlotte Whitten and so on had come well before me, but I assured many people I was no Charlotte Whitten. But I said it in the presentation. It was sewage and garbage. Those were the 2 biggest hurdles we had to overcome. We had a landfill closure, and we didn't own our own landfill. And we had this sewage overflow problem, huge problem. And I don't know how many of you travel King Street these days, where they're digging a trench to lay some kind of piping. That's the other issue around property tax. To lay a mile of pipe in Kingston probably costs about 10 times what it costs in Toronto, because we've got this thing called limestone, and so in terms of comparing costs of infrastructure servicing, it isn't just the size of the municipality, it's the kind of ground the municipality is built on as well. So there are all these mitigating factors.
So with that, the Limestone City, the final word. Thank you, Helen. Please join me in thanking Helen Cooper for addressing us.